There was an interesting comic strip that I read recently, which basically showed different generations of parents and how they interacted with their children. And it was essentially talking about how these different generations of parents often complained about the activities their children were engaging with. For example, a lot of children my age, or perhaps around my age group, can relate to the fact that if you tried playing video games, oftentimes you'd get constantly lectured by your parents. But interestingly enough, this isn't really the first time this has occurred. In fact, these kinds of intergenerational criticisms have always existed. For example, when our parents' generation was young, there were criticisms, let's say, about them constantly watching things like television, and the television set was commonly understood to be a kind of idiot box. And similarly, actually, interestingly enough, reading and writing was also considered in very ancient times to essentially be a form of distraction from the real world, right? There's an interesting meme of an Assyrian tablet which basically says that the world is coming to an end or the world is approaching its demise. And one of the things it mentions is that, everybody wants to write a book. Now, obviously for us, this would seem insane, like, writing a book, why is that a bad thing? But obviously within that mindset of, if you spend all your time, if kids nowadays or whatever spend all their time reading or writing, they're just distracted from carrying out certain tasks or obligations or whatever it may be. Ironically, that logic just keeps on extending itself across every single generation, where obviously, this is a very ancient thing, but especially in our modern times, for example, if, let's say, children engage with certain forms of technology, or children play video games, or they watch movies or whatever, parents may criticize their children for that. But ironically, there was always one thing or another which often bothered the parents of every single generation that has existed about their kids. And so you see every generation, like I mentioned in the past, in my past videos, has their own battle. Every generation has their struggles, and every generation faces criticism from their parents, and thus there is that subsequent youthful vigor and that kind of rebellious spirit that arises where they reject a lot of the common notions of the older generation. And, I find it interesting, of course, there's a few examples of this, right? That, for example, the boomer generation arguably is the most different generation from its parents. Arguably so, as Robert Toombs mentions in his book, The English Peoples and the History, there has never been such a stark contrast or such a stark difference between two generations of peoples, or between two generations of parents and children, as there was between the boomers and their parents. Of course, when you see around the time of the World Wars, and in the British context, for example, you see the Victorian age, and you see the attitudes that were prevalent then about things like purity, of cleanliness, both on a kind of moral level, on the level of chastity, and also on the level of this kind of polite society, the etiquettes and manners that one should abide by as was understood in that time. But also many of the common values like religion, like family, like, of course, many of these traditional spiritual, let's say, values. Although, of course, in the case of the West, in certain countries, that spirituality was breaking down and it was being replaced by that kind of materialism. And arguably, the kind of capitalism, the kind of liberal capitalism that was being fostered around this time obviously sows the seeds for those spiritual values destruction. But that's another point altogether in any case. But in any case, right, the boomer generation is starkly different to its parents' generations. And it's interesting to me that the boomers, who once had this youth counterculture that was predicated on this kind of radical individualism and radical rejection of the traditions that came before it, can now do a 180 really and turn around to their kids and start lecturing them about certain things that they do, or reject the youth counterculture of their children and their grandchildren's generations, when they themselves arguably engaged in the most radical youth counterculture out of all of human history. So I think that's an interesting point. But one thing I think important to mention is that when you actually look at Gen Z as well, right, inevitably when we grow up, we will also probably do the same things with our children. And a lot of times, a lot of younger kids, especially younger Gen Z, the younger Gen Z children and Gen Alpha, so the generation below me, they get a lot of stick for being iPad kids or being addicted to brain rot. And of course, look, I'm not defending brain rot or, AI deepfakes or whatever, but I think, you've got to understand that where that is coming from is it's coming from the same place as a lot of our parents and grandparents' generations constantly complaining about us playing video games, for example, or our parents, their parents constantly complaining about them watching television. Of course, I'm not saying that engaging in these activities or being obsessed with them or engaging with them in this kind of addicted, unhealthy way is good. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. But, this kind of reactionary attitude in and of itself towards these things, right? This kind of inherent reaction towards these things is inevitably something that every parent exemplifies at times or manifests towards their children. And of course, it's not every parent, but it's quite a big proportion of parents, really. I also think that beyond a certain point, this is why it's not necessarily the things in and of themselves, but what they at times represent, in that, on a symbolic or more abstract level, engaging with these activities can become a source of sort of saying screw you to what people may perceive to be the status quo. It's a kind of implicit rebellion at times, especially when you reach that kind of teenage age where you engage in that kind of youthful rebelliousness. These activities can be associated with that. These activities can foster that sense of creativity, that sense of rebelliousness even outside of any established status quo or outside any kind of establishment. In any case, outside of being merely reactive or destructive, I think people should try and be creative. And what that means is it's not really about these things in and of themselves, but rather it's about how we use them. For example, I think with video games or with things like movies or films or television, at the end of the day, these things are just forms of art, right? They are forms of artistic expression. Now, either you can have bad forms of artistic expression that speak to the lower self, perhaps, if I was to say in spiritual terms, or you could have forms of artistic expression that transcend the limits of our society, of our time, of societal expectations, and give manifest, right? They give expression to these higher passions, this kind of higher purpose and meaning that we have. And these artistic expressions can produce incredible works of meaning and beauty and produce these incredible stories that we can all cherish. Obviously, I've talked a lot about different works of art, different pieces of literature. I've talked about things like manga and anime on my channel. And of course, not every single piece of fiction within these genres is going to be good. And, people who can be overly obsessive or overly addicted to these things, that can absolutely be destructive. But at the same time, these forms of art, of artistic expression, can give rise to this creative spirit, which gives much meaning, which provides a sense of passion and purpose in one's life, which, can give expression to the deepest elements and deepest feelings of the human condition, of human nature, and express this kind of natural human creativity and curiosity in a way which perhaps you cannot through the established means of the status quo or through the traditional institutions. And of course, there's other things to consider here. These things can also be co-opted by traditional institutions. These things can be used and pushed on people to distract them, but they can also be used to facilitate this kind of creativity which breaks outside of the traditional mold, let's just say. And that's really the thing. I think every single thing at the end of the day, at times when children engage in an activity that parents perhaps disapprove of course, at times parents can have valid criticisms if, somebody's being overly obsessive or overly addicted to that, absolutely. But like I said, these things can provide creativity. Whether it be with reading or writing in ancient times, right? Whether it be with things like books or writing books, as I mentioned in the example of the Assyrian tablets, whether it be things like video games or movies and films, whether it be in the form of the television or elsewhere. And even now with things like AI, AI can be destructive and it can be used in a destructive way. But I also think it can be used in a creative way, which can facilitate genuine human creativity and passion and curiosity and understanding and of genuine human art. And it's up to us to use them in a creative manner and not simply to be reactionary against them, nor to be destructive with them.